Hello everyone, Theodore Shoebat here, giving you guys another message that you will not hear at church. I guarantee that. I guarantee that. I want to give you guys my take on the masculinist movement, right? The masculinity movement. And for years I've been hearing about the masculinity movement. I remember back in like 2010, people told me about this. You know, one of the guys who's pushing this whole masculinist thing, his name is Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson, you know, this guy who's become very popular. I want to show you guys a video. Here's a video of Jordan Peterson saying, you know, what women want are, a man who can destroy things and all these things, whatever the hell that means. I mean, what does that even mean? Like, oh, you know, a woman says, oh, I want a man who can destroy things. Like, okay, you marry a guy like that, and before you know it, you know, you're running for your life, and some guy's chasing after you with a freaking axe.
Little pigs, let me come in. Not by the hair on your chinny chin chin. Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in.
You know, and he comes out and he says, you know, what are the top 3 Google searches for women looking for porn? Oh, they're searching for werewolves, vampires, and something involving a surgeon. Ha ha ha! You see, women don't want, you know, a decent guy. They want a guy who's aggressive and destructive and all these things. And it's like, werewolves, vampires. Like, do I really even want to be involved with a woman like that? Like, are you freaking insane? But they actually come out and say shit like this, and they're like, you see, this is proof that women want blah. They want a domineering male, like the guy from 50 Shades of Grey or something like that. So play that clip.
So the Google guys tried to track down the archetypal structure of, well, they didn't use those words, of female pornography use. And so some of you know, how many of you know what a Harlequin romance is? Okay, good. So those are archetypal stories, right? That's the taming of the wild man, essentially, by the desirable and virginal woman. And if you think women don't want that, then you better bloody well come up with an explanation for 50 Shades of Grey, right? Which is the most rapid-selling novel in human history, and emerged at exactly the same time that all of this noise about the absence of gender roles is being produced, you know, en masse. It's like perfect female fantasy. It's exactly archetypally correct. It's Beauty and the Beast. So what the Google guys showed was the structure of Beauty and the Beast, although they didn't use that as a referent, that the female pornographic fantasy was wild guy, you know, somewhat careless about the wants and desires of others, attractive to everyone, therefore high status, tamed by the magic of a single woman and brought into a relationship with her. Okay, so, but here's the comical part. This just made me laugh, man. It was like, what were the 5 categories of most desirable male entity used most broadly in female pornography? Oh, it's so embarrassing. Women, you have to cover your head while I say this. Vampire, werewolf, billionaire, surgeon, and pirate.
Now, after watching that, I want to show you guys another clip in which you have Jordan Peterson with another guy named Brett Weinstein, and they're doing the Joe Rogan show. And here is Jordan Peterson and Weinstein saying that, oh, genocidal desires are natural, they are genetic. Now, of course, they'll say, well, we're not for that behavior. Of course, they have to crackerjack, and crackerjack is a term that I use to describe the way Westerners promote evil under a bullshit marketing trick in order to prevent people from pointing out to them and saying, hey, this guy is evil. So what they do is they say, I call it inverse propaganda. Inverse propaganda is another term I use for this. Basically, it is you promote something, you claim to promote something good, and at the same time promote the opposite of that good. So it's like if I say, I'm against Islam, but I'm all in favor for arming the Kurds. the reason why they utilize this strategy is so that when someone comes out and says, hey, you're promoting arming Muslims who will kill Christians, you can then come out and counter that by saying, but I condemn Islam, so you can't do that to me. That's the game that these people play. And so here's Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein, he's a good Jewish guy, but look at the bullshit he's promoting, saying, oh, genocidal desires are natural. They're in our genes. And, this is what Jordan Peterson says, it is a decent strategy to want to homogenize your society. And homogenize is simply a fancy way of saying you want to get rid of other races and make the society populated by just one race. And how else would you do that except by forced deportation and or murder? So here they are, very elusively and in a very tricky manner, promoting genocide. Play the clip.
I've studied Hitler a lot, and there's a bunch of things that you can't say about him. You can't say he was stupid.
Right.
You can't say he was without artistic talent. You can't say that he was a poor organizer. You can't say that he wasn't charismatic. You can't say that he did wonders for Germany's economy in the first part of his reign. And so it's very necessary if you're dealing intelligently with a true monster that you give the devil his due.
Yeah. So I think the thing that I saw in your video was your argument was that as he was losing, instead of putting the genocide on pause and
winning the war,
that he ratcheted up the genocide.
Yeah, I don't know if it would really be. I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that it was him that did that, although I think he had a hand in it. It does appear to me that that's what happened.
Right, and my point would simply be, and again, I couldn't possibly be less sympathetic with the individual. My point is simply that from an evolutionary point of view, if your objective is coldly to increase the number of genomes that are spelled the same way that yours are on Earth, that A, he did enslave those Jews who were most fit to work in service of the German war machine, right? That's what those camps are. Not all of the camps were work camps, but Auschwitz, for example, was both a work camp and a death camp. And so there was this tendency to enslave. And
so let me ask you a question about this, because, I think you have to make a pretty tenuous biological argument to say that there's evolutionary utility in increasing the number of your kinsmen, but unless they're very close. But here's a slight variation of that. You tell me what you think about this. Is it reasonable to presume that a decent survival strategy is to homogenize your environment with regards to, under some conditions, to homogenize your environment with regards to racial or ethnic differences to decrease the probability that you and yours are going to be killed?
Oh, yeah. Again, no defense of this,
yes.
But you are right that to the extent that there's another population that's distinct, that population, even if it is small and has little power now, might not be small and have little power later. And so undoubtedly that program is there too.
Okay.
But I would say that the tendency to believe that evolution only functions at the level of kin when you're talking about very close relatives, I believe is an error that is the result of the fact that evolutionists early on wished to operationalize fitness. And it's very hard to operationalize fitness across population level differences. And so they built a definition that is about immediate kin, but there's no logical reason to imagine that peters out at the edge.
So
all I'm arguing is that what Hitler did was go after a population inside his border that was more distantly related to the people who were his constituents, and then he went obviously after Eastern Europe and sought the future of Germany in Russia, and it took 12 million Russians to turn around the German war machine. I mean, those are military deaths. There were vastly more civilian deaths. But the point is, he did not succeed in doing what he set out to do, but he also didn't fail in the sense that he took a bunch of resources that belonged to a population that was more distantly related and he got rid of those people. And by getting rid of them, increased the amount of resource that was available to Aryans. This has nothing to do, genes are not interested in figuring out which genes are superior. All of the language about German superiority is nonsense. However, genes are very interested, I mean, they're obviously genes, they don't think, but they act as if they are interested in replacing alternative spellings.
And so part of the reason that you're walking through this, just so that the track of this remains self-evident, is to caution people against, to alert people to the fact that the sorts of programs that Hitler both ran and elicited from people are lurking in our, let's say, in our genome, in our set of biological possibilities. And we have to be very awake to that fact on an ongoing basis.
They are lurking in our genomes, which does not mean that we as adults have this as a possibility. Many people will not go along with this. Other people have it lurking to be triggered. And I think, what worries me is that Trump, I think very cynically, utilized this lurking program in order to gain office. That he played upon the fact that certain people were waiting to hear those noises.
And these are the people that the masses are following. All under the name of fighting feminism, and we want to become masculine. And as Nazario Moreno did, as Jack Donovan is doing, as all these other freaks are doing, they are promoting evil in the name of being masculine. And people told me about this book that was very popular at that time. It was called Wild at Heart, and it was written by a guy named John Eldredge. And I looked into this book, and it was about, be a man and step up your game, and you gotta be masculine, you gotta be men, and it was all about, going to the forest and all this stuff, and it was about being a real man. And it was about, being tough and being like a lion, and one of the verses that Eldredge bases his theology on is the idea that, because we are made in the image of God, and God is described as the Lion of Judah, then we have to be like lions. Well, lions get their prey and tear them apart. I mean, lions slaughter other animals, and so he's saying, be like a lion. It's like, that's strange, and he's making all these theological arguments, but it's like, it just doesn't fit in with Orthodox Christianity. It does not fit in with true Christianity. Orthodox Christianity, what you see in the Roman Catholic theology, what you see in the Orthodox theology, it just doesn't fit in with that, because the Orthodox theology and the Roman Catholic theology, that is orthodoxy, because those are the two apostolic churches. Those two churches can trace their lineages all the way back to the apostles. And so anytime someone comes up with, a book on Christianity or theology, I always see, does it conform with what the church fathers taught? Does it conform with Orthodox Christianity? And I always like to use the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches as, I like to use them as authorities by which to measure things. And when you look at Eldredge's book, John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart, there's this one theological argument that he likes to use, that Adam was not made in the Garden of Eden. Adam was not created in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was not his first home. He actually argues that Adam was born in a garden before the Garden of Eden, a garden that was wild and that was uncouth, and that after he was created, he was then placed by God in the Garden of Eden. And he says, and it's actually quite blasphemous what he says that this is where man first became domesticated. He actually says this, and so he is blaming God for the weakness that man has been doing, right? All the weaknesses that man has been exhibiting. And so our domestication is due to God putting us in this nice, comfortable garden as opposed to leaving Adam in this wild and uncouth place. So right there you see the heresy. And from this heresy you have more heresies and you have more problems. It always leads to more problems. Heresies always lead to physical activities that are evil. All evil activities, be it violence, murder, genocide, homosexuality, perversion, all of that stems from a corrupt internal belief, a corrupt belief that is internally believed. That's why James, in his epistle, he says, show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. In other words, our actions are simply manifestations of what we believe internally. And so all evil beliefs, all evil actions spring from evil beliefs. And even if a person says he's a Christian, if he does evil actions, he is in fact enacting a false gospel. His actions manifest a false gospel. It's like what Erasmus said when he was describing the Protestants. He says that the Protestants preach all these good things, but their actions preach a different gospel. He actually says this. So our actions actually preach what we believe in. Our actions are manifestations of they're manifestations of the theology that we believe internally, regardless of what we may say, and notwithstanding how good the things we say may sound. Our actions actually are the manifestation of what we really believe in. And so all evil heresy springs and leads to evil actions, be it genocide, murder, perversions, all these things. That's why St. Paul in Romans 1, he says that they corrupted the image of God into something else. You know, they begin to, instead of worshiping the true God, they began to worship the creation over the creator, and they made God to be like a crawling creature. And then in that same chapter, he describes how these very pagans went into homosexuality and violence and all of these evil actions. It's because, and what St. Paul was elucidating here was that our evil actions spring from our evil beliefs. That's why opinions matter. That's why belief systems matter. That's why it really matters what people believe in. That's why I believe we should control the collective and try to maintain the collective belief system. If we have a good collective belief system, we should maintain it and protect it. That's why the Catholic Church had the Inquisition. It was to maintain the collectively held belief system that was good and that held the society together. Right when you have things like freedom of religion and freedom of beliefs, things go crazy and people start doing evil things. Anyway, that book that John Eldredge wrote, Wild at Heart, ended up becoming very popular in Mexico, specifically in the southern Mexican state of Michoacan. And it began to be popularized in Mexico in, I want to say in like 2013 or something. And it was popularized by a cult called the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar was a cartel. It was a narco, but it was also a cult. It was a religious group. And it didn't initially begin as just a straight up drug dealing gang. It actually started out as a religious movement. It started out it was eventually called the Knights Templar, but initially it was actually called La Familia Michoacana, which means the Michoacanese family. Kind of like what's his face? Charlie Manson. You know, Charles Manson started this cult called the Family. Well, this was like the Charlie Manson of Mexico. It was like the family of Mexico. It was called La Familia Michoacana. It was started by a guy named Nazario Moreno. Now, Nazario Moreno, originally born in Michoacan, but he went to California, and while he was in California, he actually met John Eldredge, read his book, became an evangelical. You know, he found the Lord and all this stuff. Found Jesus, became born again. But how would you do it in a Mexican way, you know? I found the Lord. I found Jesus. You know, I become born again now. I find the Lord now. I'm not with that Roman Catholic stuff. That's Babylon, man. That's pagan. I'm with the Lord now. I'm with Jesus. You know, I found the Jesus. I'm now born again. You know, I now have salvation. I'm not with that stuff. That's the Antichrist, man. And you know, Gloria a Dios and all that stuff. Well, Nazario Moreno became a part of that, and he actually met John Eldredge, thanked him, said he really liked his book and all this stuff. Well, Moreno ends up getting arrested for a drug offense, and the U.S. government deports him back to Mexico. So while he's in Mexico, this happened under the Obama administration, if I'm not mistaken. He goes back to Mexico and he starts a religious organization to supposedly get people rehabilitated from drug addiction. And a lot of people follow him, and he begins to build a reputation as a spiritual healer and as a man who's going to get you out of drugs. And eventually he becomes popular, and really popular, and starts almost like a mega church. And he has this reputation of being like a very spiritual person, like a medicine healer, a healer who will heal people from diseases and all these things. So then he starts his rehab center, and he's getting all these people out of drugs. Well, one of the conditions that one had to commit to before going into his rehabilitation center was you had to be a member of the cult. You had to be a member of the church, their church. You had to be a member, and you had to be loyal to Nazario Moreno. So this group becomes it transforms, it devolves, or evolves, I should say. It changes from being just a drug rehab center to now a full-blown militant cult where everyone is loyal to Nazario Moreno, and they are willing to kill for Nazario Moreno. They're willing to kill for this cult, La Familia Michoacana. And La Familia Michoacana eventually, you know, they get weapons, they get guns. Of course, they're armed by the Mexican government, which really makes you wonder, like, how these groups get really powerful. They get powerful with the help of government. And they get armed and all that, and they eventually defeat the dominating cartel in Mexico. It was called Las Zetas. They were very violent. They were like the ISIS of the narcos. And the reason why I say that is not to say that the Zetas were worse than the Templars. No, they're both just as bad. But because the media attention on Las Zetas was much higher, simply due to the fact that Las Zetas was the most open about its violence. I mean, they butchered, they slaughtered, and they made headlines all over the media, international headlines. And they committed a lot of massacres. And so these guys dominated Michoacan. And, you know, ISIS has been the most open terrorist group about its massacres. They film their massacres, they take photos, they do all sorts of things like that. They're more into the marketing. In other words, Las Zetas and ISIS are similar insofar as they both heavily marketed their atrocities as opposed to other groups. Anyway, so La Familia Michoacana eventually becomes the Knights Templar, right? It was called the Caballeros Templarios in Spanish. And the Caballeros Templarios, the Knights Templar, interestingly enough, they used a Catholic term, and that was really to guise their evil with religious terminology to make it seem more noble and more righteous, more valorous and all that. Well, they ended up defeating Las Zetas. And I remember years ago, the media was praising, people in the media were praising the Templars as heroes. Like, and I'm not saying like CNN was doing this, but there were people actually on the internet saying things like, oh my God, these people are heroes. They're defeating the Zetas. They're called the Knights Templar, so they must be good Mexican Catholics, and they're doing the Lord's work. And that's actually how they got a lot of followers, and that's actually how they won the favor of a lot of people in Michoacan, because now they were hailed as heroes. It's kind of like what the Nazis did with the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks came in, they began to conquer Poland, they began to expand into Germany, they got really close to Berlin. They were openly anti-Christian, openly anti-God. They openly expressed their hatred for the natural order, and they were very scary. The Nazis come along and they say, we're for Christian values, we are for Catholic values, you know, we are for all these things. We must fight for the Fuhrer because he is now a protector of good Christian values. And so the Nazis come in as the heroes, and hell, they even fooled the Catholic Church for a little bit. The Catholic Church initially thought, hey, maybe we can work with these Nazis because they would defeat the Bolsheviks. But fairly quickly, the Catholic Church realized that that was the wrong route to take, and the Nazis were just a lot more deceptive than the Bolsheviks. So it was a similar situation in Mexico, where the Zetas were really bad. They were openly Satanist, openly devil worshippers. The Templars come along, and they give this overbearing Christian presence. And so they win the trust of a lot of people. So the cult of Nazario Moreno grows even further. Now, when Nazario Moreno first started out as a religious leader, he wrote a manifesto. You can actually read this on the internet. And he explicitly references John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart, in his manifesto. And Moreno says that he had a spiritual revelation in this place in Michoacan. It was called the Hungarian Hill. I assume it was called the Hungarian Hill because a lot of Hungarians and other Eastern European people actually migrated to Mexico, I believe in the 19th century, around that time. And I'm assuming that that was a place where a lot of Hungarians settled. So it was called the Hungarian Hill. And he went to the Hungarian Hill, and he went on top of the hill, and he supposedly had this religious experience. And he openly promoted John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart. In fact, he even made it required reading for people who wanted to get into the higher levels in the hierarchy of the cult. So if you were a lower level guy, it was like, okay, whatever, you don't have to read the book. But right when you wanted to, get up there in the hierarchy, you had to read the literature. So you had to read Nazario Moreno's manifesto, but you also had to read John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart. And when you look at that book, and this really gets to the heart of the matter for the subject of this video, when you read Moreno's manifesto, he talks about how men need to become men, and men are becoming weak, and they're becoming feminine, and they're becoming just timid. And he openly references, I remember reading this manifesto in Spanish. Of course, I had to use Google Translate because my Spanish isn't that good. But nonetheless, near the beginning of the book, he talks about, and he references John Eldredge in this line. He talks about how women complain about how they can't find a real man. Where are all the good men? Where have all the good men gone? Which is a complete bullshit statement. It's a statement that women use to get sympathy from people, and that's a whole other conspiracy unto itself. But John Eldredge actually writes this in his book. A lot of women complain, where have all the good men gone? And this is a game that a lot of evangelical pastors play because they know that there are a lot of women in the congregation. And I believe that it's simply a way to get the favor of the females. You say, a lot of women out there are saying, where have all the good men gone? And there's no good men out there, and blah, blah, blah. And all the women are like, yeah, he's saying what I'm thinking. And it's all the way to kind of, it's all really a form of manipulation to get the favor of the women. And so the women could be like, oh, pastor, and all this stuff, and he's this amazing leader and this amazing man of God. And of course, you get the men riled up when you say things like that. So the men now want to get more involved, and because the pastor will say something like, if you want to find a good woman of God, then get active in the church. And so now you got all these men who are willing to volunteer, and it's all just a form of manipulation to get leverage over the people and all this stuff. But I have a lot to say about that. But anyway, in this one part of Eldredge's book, he says, a lot of women complain that they can't find good men. Well, Nazario Moreno takes this line from Eldredge, translates it into Spanish, and just puts it in there. It's verbatim from Eldredge's book. And what Moreno was doing was he was using this way of propaganda to get men to follow him. In other words, he was using it to get men to commit evil. Because when you go to a bunch of men, we're human beings. We all have our insecurities and all these things. What happens always is that you have these scam artists, like Nazario Moreno, like a lot of these mega church pastors. You have a lot of these scam artists who understand that human beings have insecurities. And so they go up to them and they're like, "You're not a real man. You want to be a real man? Then do this, 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 and that." And because they see this pastor, he's on the stage, he's on this position of intellectual superiority, they tend to follow them. It's kind of like what the military does. The military will also play this game where they'll go to high schools where men are even more insecure. They go to high schools and they have these recruiting centers. And I remember seeing it when I was in high school. I'm sure all of you guys saw it when you were in high school. And you have these guys who are very good recruiters, and they know what to say. They know how to capitalize on your insecurities. And they're like, you want to do something good for your country. You want to do something good for America. When have you ever done anything for America? You're just a, useless citizen. You have to be an active citizen. You need to be a productive citizen. You want to do something with your life. You want to make something out of your life. And for a lot of these guys, they're just living average lifestyles. They're not really doing anything that is distinct from what anyone else is doing. So and there's nothing really wrong with that. I mean, we all for the most part, live average lives, but it's just that, to the human mind, the grass is always greener on the other side, and we always want to make something out of our lives. And I guess that's natural, because we should strive to make a difference in the world, but for good, not for bad. But the military understands that. They understand this psychology, and they capitalize on that. They manipulate that. And so that's how you get recruits. That's how you get recruits for the military. And it's the same thing with gangs. The military recruits people like a gang would recruit people. Gangs go to people who are drug addicts, or they come from very broken homes, or both. They don't have a father figure. And what happens is that when you have a lot of guys who don't have fathers, the gang becomes the father, right? The gang leader becomes the father. And so Nazario Moreno plays this game where he's like, where are all the real men? You guys are a bunch of simps. You're a bunch of wussies. You're feminine. You've been just completely conditioned through feminization. And what that does is it makes the person look at a guy like Moreno and be like, well, yeah, he's right. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really done much with my life, and I should do something much with my life. What should I do? Well, join our gang. And so they use this form of propaganda as a way to get you to commit evil. Because when you study the Knights Templars, it began as a group that was doing seemingly noble deeds, helping drug addicts get out of drug addiction. Well, that's a really good thing. And a lot of people got out of the drug addiction. But then they would say, okay, because we helped you get out of drug addiction, now you need to join the Knights Templar cartel. They would join the Knights Templar cartel. They would give them guns, maybe put them through some training, some paramilitary training or whatever, and they would say, okay, well, now we need to fight evil. And the evil is Las Zetas, and the Zetas were evil. And so, yeah, the Zetas are evil. They rape, they kill, they kidnap people, they force women into sex slavery, they make slaves, they're demonic people. So they go out and they kill the Zetas. Well, that's a good thing. And then all of a sudden it escalates into something else. It transitions now into something else, and there is this constant change. And when you look at the vicissitudes, the changing faces of these groups, you can see that there is a common pattern in all these groups. They all start out doing really good deeds, then they continue doing some good deeds, but then once they get enough leverage over the society, they then become just as evil, or if not more evil, than the groups that they dominated, that they have vanquished, that they have gotten rid of. So in the case of Michoacan, Knights Templar defeats Las Zetas. Well, that's really good. Las Zetas is gone. Hallelujah, blah, blah, blah. But then it's like, okay, now we want you to go kidnap women, make them into sex slaves. You are now going to murder people. You're going to murder innocent people. And the Knights Templar became just as violent as Las Zetas. And they became the sex traffickers. They became the mass murderers. They became the people putting others into slavery. They became the genocidal people. But they did it by hiding behind the truth. And this is why I always say that, well, it's like what St. Paul said. A little leaven leaveneth up the whole batch, right? A little leaven ruins the whole batch. And I would argue, and this is something that I learned from my father, that the group that has the least amount of leaven, and at the same time they still have leaven, but albeit it's a small amount, nonetheless, the group that has the smallest amount of leaven is actually the worst because it's the most deceptive. And so that's what these masculinist groups do. And I would argue that this whole, you could trace the masculinity movement all the way back to like the 1800s, maybe. You can even trace it back to the 1950s and all that. But the masculinist movement that we see today, I would argue that you could probably trace it back to John Eldredge. John Eldredge really helped start this movement. And you see it. It's like masculinity, masculinity. But then and this is what a lot of these groups do. You can see this in the website. One of the most popular masculinist websites in the world right now. It's called The Art of Manliness. A very popular website, especially for young Christian men in America. And you see it in these groups. They'll be like, well, we're masculinists, and we have to look at the examples of our Greco-Roman roots, because America is part of Western culture, and so Western culture is rooted in Christianity and Greco-Roman culture. Well, I'm all for Christianity, but what's this stuff about, the Greco-Roman culture? And then you'll see this in these websites. I don't even have to show it. You can see this for yourself. I mean, it's there. It's all over the place within these groups. It's like, well, a great model is the Spartans and the samurai and all this stuff. And before, it's like, when these groups first begin, it's like, let's be masculine, let's be men, let's go out in the forest and, chop trees down. And you always see a guy with an axe, and they're always showing these guys with like flannel shirts and big beards or whatever. But then you start looking more into these groups and you find out, okay, it's not all just about that. There's also a spiritual component in this. And that's when they begin to promote things like the Spartan culture and the samurai culture. And I've even seen one of them, a guy who's really big in the masculinist movement, is Jack Donovan, sodomite neo-Nazi. Sodomite neo-Nazi. That's one of the major figures behind this movement. And he even will say, oh, a great example of a masculine culture is, the Palestinians and how they get bombs and blow themselves up. That's a great masculinist culture. And he will refer to the Spartans. He will refer to the samurai as also great examples of all this. And interestingly enough, Jack Donovan, who's actually connected with the Art of Manliness website, Jack Donovan actually openly references John Eldredge, and he says that John Eldredge influenced the Knights Templar. So it's almost like it goes, intellectually speaking, ideologically speaking, it all goes full circle. You have John Eldredge, and John Eldredge influenced the Knights Templar. And then John Eldredge, his works also influence these other people, these other, masculinist groups that are also evil, and they're degenerate and pagan and all that. And what's interesting is you look at John Eldredge's theology, it's obviously heretical, and it's obviously calling for violence. Just look at it. It's like, we have to be lions and all these things, and that's what a real man does, and a woman wants a real man. And again, it's tinkering into the insecurities of men. All men want a woman, and all men desire a woman. And so how do you get these men to follow you? You capitalize on that desire. You capitalize on a lot of insecurities that men have. Like, oh, can I attract a woman? Am I attractive? Et cetera, et cetera. These are all insecurities. There's actually a saying that I heard a number of years ago, and that was that to know someone's desires is to know their weaknesses. And so it's a harsh reality. And when you know that, well, it's a given fact that men want women, then you can capitalize on that desire, because that desire ultimately is a weakness. So you say, well, a real woman wants bum, 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 bum. And right when you can be the artifice or the establisher of, what a woman wants, then you can begin to determine how men should act, because men will act in accordance to what women want, because they want a female. So they take advantage of this and they say, well, what a woman wants is boom, 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 boom. And then the people who are loyal to your ideology or to whatever bullshit you're spouting, they will follow you because they want a woman. Well, Nazario Moreno played a very similar game. He said, he says this in his manifesto, a real woman wants blah, 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 blah. And what's interesting is that Nazario Moreno's cult was an evangelical cult. It was an evangelical / narco group. It didn't initially begin selling drugs, though. It initially began as a Christian cult. It only later on began to sell drugs. And it also got into sex trafficking as well. What's interesting is that one of the assassins of the Knights Templar, what was his name? He was actually the most famous Sicario for the Knights Templar, and the most famous Sicario in Mexico at one point in time, just a number of years ago. What was his name? Knights Templar. What was his name? Oh, here it is. His name was Brawley Banderas. That was his nickname, but you can look it up. Brawley Banderas. He was the most famous Sicario in Mexico at one point in time. And here's something that's really scary. Brawley Banderas was a homosexual. He's dead now, but he was a sodomite, according to some reports that I read. So here you have this Protestant sect claims to be religious, like the Nazis. The Nazis claimed to be religious, claimed to be for Christian values, but then the Nazis were also filled with homosexuals and they had sodomites in their ranks. And with the rise of evangelicalism in Mexico, you also have the rise of narco violence, and this is a fact. Yes, you've always had mafia in Mexico, but mafia is mafia and narcos are another thing. Mafia is like the Italian mafia. Yeah, they're bad, but they still have some rules and regulations that they govern themselves by. Whereas narcos have no rules. You have the old school Mexican mafia. Yes, they were corrupt and evil, but still they had some Catholic morality there. Whereas with these newer school narcos, these guys have no rules. They murder anybody they want. And so with the rise of Protestantism in Mexico, because Protestantism has had a recent surge in popularity in Mexico, with the rise of Protestantism in Mexico, you also at the same time have a rise in narco violence. You also at the same time have a rise in occultism, and that correlates directly with narco violence because narcos are all involved in the occult. And with the rise of all of these things, you also have the rise of homosexuality. So they all coincide. All of these evils and heresies coincide with each other. They all rise up. Now, that's not to say that all Protestants are narcos or anything like that. Not saying that at all. Sure, there are a lot. I know that there are a lot of good people who are evangelicals and Protestants. Don't get me wrong. But what I am saying is that when you have this sort of decay in the orthodox established religion of the land, you also have disarray in other things as well. Disarray in morality, disarray in the orderliness of society. The orderliness of society begins to fall apart. To reference St. Thomas Aquinas says that there are two things required for an orderly society. One, you need an orderly way of life, and two, you need a peaceful, orderly way of life. So you need order, but at the same time, that order has to correspond with peace. So when the status quo or when the order begins to decline, then everything else begins to decline at the same time. So Protestantism is all about what? Protesting. It's about rebelliousness. It's of its very essence, it's all about protesting and rebellion against the natural order, against the ecclesiastical order. And so when you have that rise of rebellion, guess what? That rebellion is going to manifest in different ways and in many very detrimental ways, like narco violence and things of that sort. And so here's Brawley Banderas. He joins this evangelical cult. He becomes a killer, a murderer for the evangelical cult. And he's a sodomite. But here's the thing, is that women love Brawley Banderas. You can look this up. Women loved Brawley Banderas. And I remember reading an interview that Brawley Banderas did. He became a freaking celebrity. That's another indication that society has decayed. When you see that murderers now become famous. You know, cult leaders now become famous. That's an indication as to that's an indication of a decayed society. That's how you know a society has gone decayed, when those who are famous and revered are not the good people, but the very decayed and evil people. And sadly enough, that actually has been the case for a very long time. You know, even during the 1950s. Oh, 1950s, that was the era of good family values and all that nonsense. And I remember reading this interview, and Brawley Banderas said that before I became an assassin for the Templars, women wanted nothing to do with me. Now that I am a murderer and I burn people alive, he actually talks about this, you know, murdering people, burning people alive, all these things. Now that I am a murderer and I burn people alive, I have women coming from different parts of Mexico to my area and literally fighting for me. Females compete, I wouldn't even call them women, they're just animals at that point. But females fighting over a murderer, you know, over who's going to have sex with a murderer, a psychopath, a serial killer. People, a guy who murders other people for a living. And so we have to understand that when these masculinist groups come along and say, hey, you know, what a woman really wants is someone who can destroy things, someone who's destructive. They're wrong for saying that, I mean, morally wrong, but at the same time, they are reflecting a dark reality. And that is, women love these types of men. And I've heard all sorts of bullshit excuses. Oh, they want to fix them. That makes absolutely no sense, because we have seen plenty of accounts from women who say that they love violent behavior. And they love it when a man has these sorts of dark traits. We know this also from the fact that, look at all the sales for that book, 50 Shades of Grey. I call it 50 Shades of Shit. It's a story about a woman, and I never really read the book, but I read about the book, so I have an idea as to what the story is. It's about a woman who is a sex slave to a guy, and the guy chains her up like a dog and whips her and puts her in a cage and whatever. All this sick, horrific things. But that sold. Explain to me how that book sold by the millions in America. And guess where it sold the most? In the Bible Belt. And all these Christian women of glory, hallelujah, in the house of the Lord, all these women were buying this book. Oh, but they're just wonderful women of Jesus, and they love the Lord. You know, they go to Starbucks, and they just love their wasabi sushi, and they're just amazing women of God, and they're reading sadistic pornography. So we're living in a very sick society, and these masculinist movements are coming along, and they're taking advantage of this. They're like, oh, women want this. And so here is Moreno, and he's telling these men who are like, you know, on the fringes of society, nobody cares about them, they are the insignificant people of society. Moreno comes along and says, you can become significant, and you can get females if you join me. Guess what happens? Females come. Because females, I don't know what has happened to these women. Well, I have an idea, but women like these sorts of men. And, you know, you'll have all these women who say, oh, that's not true, that's bullshit. Because look at who's getting all the females. Drug dealers, cult leaders, bullshit artists, scam artists, fast talkers. Those are the ones that get the women. And now you have the masculinist movement coming along and really promoting that sort of bitch behavior. And Bitchistan has taken over the world. You know, people keep saying Sharia law is going to take over the world. I'm like, listen, Bitchistan has conquered the world, and Sharia law has its work cut out for it, because it's going to have to, if it wants to take over the world, it's going to have to take over Bitchistan. And that's going to be very difficult. That's going to be a tough hill to assail. Anyway, you look at this masculinist movement. You look at websites like The Art of Manliness. Who are they interviewing? Who are they with? Who are they associating themselves with? They're associating themselves with people like John Eldredge, but they're also associating themselves with another guy named Jack Donovan. Now here's the thing. Jack Donovan, sodomite, pagan, neo-Nazi, the whole thing. Here is a guy who says, a deviant, who says that white people can lie to non-whites, that white people don't have to be truthful to non-whites, that you can be as deceptive as you want as long as you're talking with someone who's not part of your tribe. And so who are guiding this masculinist movement? People who are involved in the occult, sodomites, deceivers, heretics, all of these evil people, all of these sons of Sodom are directing this whole thing. And they're doing it under the guise of masculinity, trying to get men to become more masculine and all this nonsense. And I see it also in Catholic circles. You see it in Michael Voris. Michael Voris comes out and says, men need to be more masculine. Well, it turns out that Michael Voris is a sodomite, and he's working with another sodomite named Milo Yiannopoulos, another one of these freaks who talks about masculinity and all this jargon. And Christine Niles is a woman. She's a woman who works for... I didn't want to just stop at that. She's a woman, and let me tell you more. She's a woman who works with for Michael Voris. She is the media director for Michael Voris's studio. What's it called? Church Militant TV. And you'll watch Christine Niles, and Christine Niles is like, well, men have become utterly feminized. They've been conditioned to the feminization of society and all this. And you hear this kind of talk. But then Christine Niles will then promote Milo Yiannopoulos, a sodomite, who says that homosexuals are superior to non-homosexuals. Homosexuals inherit a superior intelligence genetically than normal people. And they are superior in intelligence genetically to people who aren't perverts. Christine Niles will promote this guy. And when I confronted Michael Voris on this, Christine Niles wrote to me and said that I was the one who wrote the words in favor for Milo. And she actually said that we, Church Militant TV, are actually on the same page with Milo on the church's teachings. And maybe they are because they're both for Sodom and Gomorrah, and they both are against the church's teachings. But they meant it not in that sense. They meant it in the sense that they're both orthodox, which is bullshit. And Christine Niles said, I was the one who wrote those words, and I stand by it 100%. That is what Christine Niles said to me. And I called her a shameless bitch, and I do not take my words back because that's what she is. But here is the point. The point is that at one moment she'll say, oh, the feminization of society, and then in the next moment she promotes homosexuality. And that is what these people are doing. They're like, masculinity, yeah! And then it's like, well, listen to Jack Donovan, and let's go back to the Spartans. And let's talk about the Spartans. Because the Spartans have, ever since the film 300 came out, the Spartans have become an image that people are using, that certain groups are using, insidious groups, I should say, are using to promote their idea of masculinity, or to promote, masculine, they're using the Spartans as a model, so that when they talk to men about masculinity, they say, "Oh, look at the Spartans, right?" Well, the Spartans were a bunch of pagans who worshipped demons, because the Apostle Paul says that the gods of the pagans are not gods; they are demons. I believe also King David says this in the Psalms. And the Spartans were people who made it obligatory to be homosexual. You actually can read this in the ancient archives, in the ancient histories of antiquity. There was actually one ancient book that talked a lot in detail on the Spartans. But in this book, it talks about. I just want to look this up, see if I can find it here. Oh my goodness! I don't script these videos. I have an idea as to what I want to talk about, and bam. I forgot the name of the guy, but he was an ancient Roman historian, and he talked about Sparta. And in this book, he talks about how in Spartan society, when a boy reached the age of 7 years old, he had to be taken by the military and sodomized by a military instructor. And what they did, and this was done by law. By law, when a boy hits the age of 7, has to be sodomized. And then they believed that by sodomizing the boy, the military instructor, Plutarch, that was the name of the writer. I had to get that off my chest. Plutarch, that was his name. Plutarch wrote this book on Sparta. If you want to learn about Sparta, that is the go-to book, because it's ancient and it's very detailed. But Plutarch explains that in ancient Sparta, when a boy reached the age of 7, the boy had to be sodomized. And this was done under the belief that the military instructor who sodomized the boy was infusing his masculinity, infusing his manliness into the boy. And the samurai had the same beliefs that a young samurai boy had to be sodomized, and by doing that, the manliness of the more experienced samurai would be infused in the boy. And they actually had these beliefs. And also in Spartan society, a man was obligated to have not just a wife, but also a male partner. So you had to be homosexual. And the reason why they did this was because they were afraid. This is amazing, because this was all the way back in antiquity. This is not the 1960s. They were afraid that there would be overpopulation in the city. So to keep the population at a maintained number, they would say, okay, you have sex with your wife for procreation, but then you had sex with the man for pleasure. This is actually the perversity that they taught. You can imagine the kind of sickness that St. Paul had to witness, trying to teach and preach to the pagans. It must have been utterly horrific, which is, I think that's what really inspired Paul when he wrote Romans 1. Of course, the Holy Spirit was inspiring him, but when, God works in reality, because God is reality. And so when you are in reality and you see what's going on in front of you, you have this zeal and this anger against this evil, and God uses that for good. And when I said God is reality, I don't mean that God is the evil that you see in reality, but that God is reality in the sense that without him, it would not exist. Without him, reality would not exist. So he is the truth. That's what I meant by that. But my point is that the fact that the masculinist movements are promoting people like Jack Donovan or Milo, and also the fact that, oh, and by the way, Milo and Jack Donovan work together. There's actually a video of them together on YouTube that you can see. The fact that they are promoting these sodomites, the fact that they are promoting sodomites culture, like that of the Spartans or that of the samurai, actually indicates the agenda of this movement. And it's not to make men men. It's to make a pagan, violent, and sodomite society. That is really what this is about at the end of the day. And I really had to get this to you guys because I'm just sick of hearing it. I'm sick of hearing all of these scammers sit there and talk about, oh, how society is so feminized, when in reality, they're promoting the very evil that they claim to be against. I'm so sick of hearing these bullshit artists sit there and, oh, the feminization of society and blah, 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 and all this nonsense. And at the same time, they are promoting homosexuality and paganism and racialism and all of these evils. I'm sick of it. Sick of it. And I really had to get this video out there. If you look at that book, John Eldredge, the book written by John Eldredge, Wild at Heart, which I think is the book that really helped start this all. If you read that book, you can read it for free on the internet. And he talks about being like a lion, and he blames God for the domestication of man. It was God's fault why we are weak. What is that all about? It's about getting you to follow Satan. Now, he won't say follow the devil. He will say follow God. But he's asking you to follow his God, his view of God, his misconstrued, I was going to say misconception, but that would imply that he's just a poor, deceived man, which he's not. He's evil. His misconstrued perception of God. And he's trying to get you to follow this animalistic God. This God that really this God that really feeds into our ego, and that is not the true God. It's a demon, right? Or it's Satan himself. And if you take John Eldredge's theology and you really apply it in its most fundamental way, you will end up with violence. That's what the Mexicans did, these Mexican narco people. Nazario Moreno took Eldredge's book, applied it in its most fundamental way, and you ended up with a violent cult. And if you look at Jack Donovan is taking that same sort of belief system that Eldredge is promoting, although I would say that Donovan is promoting it in a more pagan way. Jack Donovan is actually more honest than Eldredge in the sense that Donovan is actually saying, I'm for paganism. Whereas Eldredge is saying, well, I'm doing it for Christianity. So Eldredge is preaching this evil under the guise of Christianity. Donovan is doing it as a pagan. But nonetheless, they're both just as evil. It's just that one is more deceptive than the other. And they both lead to the same things. They both will lead to the same things. We saw it in Mexico. And we're starting to see it culminating into what it's supposed to be, that is violence and genocide. We're seeing that culminating in the Western world. Hence why Jack Donovan goes to Germany. And I played this video for you guys in one of my last videos. Jack Donovan goes to Germany and says, oh, be violent. Violence is good. In fact, Jack Donovan uses Christian terminology. He says, violence should be a sacrament. And you see what happens when you replace the Catholic sacraments, the sacraments of confession, of the Eucharist, of baptism, of marriage. What happens when you replace the true sacraments is you end up with sacraments anyway, but you end up with evil sacraments, with false sacraments, because I believe we as human beings are naturally sacramental. We need sacraments as human beings. You can't get rid of sacraments. That's why pagans kind of had their own sacramentalism. And you see this sacramentalism in ancient Israel. You see it in the life of Abraham when he goes to the priest Melchizedek. And that was, just to explain further, Melchizedek gives the bread and the wine to Abraham as a sacrifice to God. That was the foreshadowing sacrament of the ultimate sacraments, which is what was established by Jesus Christ in the Last Supper, and also what was established when he told the apostles, whoever sins that you forgive shall be forgiven. Whosoever sins you shall not forgive, they shall not be forgiven. Thus, at that point, establishing the sacrament of confession. When you get rid of these sacraments, what happens is you end up with sacraments anyway, but evil sacraments. Violence becomes a sacrament all of a sudden. Homosexuality becomes a sacrament. Perversity becomes a sacrament. And my colleague, Andrew Biazad, is actually working on a study on this right now. Me and him have been talking about it, and he has been telling me some of the stuff that he's finding. Very bizarre, but he's studying the perverse rituals of the Vikings, and he told me that what he's finding out is that the Vikings actually did a ritual. Now, he's going into this ancient Scandinavian text. I believe it's something like the Wisdom of Odin or something. And he's saying that if you look at some of the translations that have been done, if you look at some of the Scandinavian text and all that, what you can extrapolate from it is that the Vikings actually believed in consuming, this is going to sound very gross, and it is, male semen. And they believed that by consuming this, they would actually get the power of that male. It's kind of like what the Native Indians used to do when they would eat the heart of their enemies. They would actually consume human hearts and human flesh with the belief that they would also absorb their power. The ancient Egyptians had this belief as well. And what he's finding out about this evil Viking ritual, it's parallel to what the Spartans did. By sodomizing this boy, you infuse his masculinity. And so these sickos are promoting these ancient cultures. Viking culture, Aztec culture, samurai, Spartan. And you can see what this is leading to. You can see what these types of movements are leading to. They are leading to homosexuality and violence and things like this. And so the fact that these people, these Scandinavian pagans who are, not surprisingly, I mean, it's not surprisingly in the sense of the fact that you see these evil groups becoming more and more popular. Um, Not surprising, these people are using the Vikings as this image of true masculinity. You even see this in the counter jihad movement. When are the Vikings of Scandinavia going to rise up and fight the Muslims? And again, they're promoting these pagan groups, promoting these pagan cultures. And the fact that the Vikings did this evil ritual, swallowing male semen and all that, that was actually one of their sacraments. And violence was a sacrament. Homosexuality was a sacrament in the Vikings. That's why they believed that when they died, they would just live eternally fighting and killing each other and having sex and drinking wine. Because violence and perversity and degeneracy becomes a sacrament right when you get rid of the Catholic faith. It's like with Islam. What do you have with Islam? When you die, you will just live eternally sodomizing boys, having sex with virgins, and drinking wine forever. Well, what's that about? That is making violence and perversity and degeneracy into a sacrament. So the fact that these groups, masculinist groups, have become so popular is a sign that we are actually heading towards war. Now, why do I say that? Very, very interesting observation. One, we are living in the most anti-woman, and I should say anti-man era in the history of humanity. We have now more anti-woman sentiment and anti-male or anti-man sentiment than at any other point in human history. You can read Sumerian text, Greek text, and you'll find some things that are hateful towards women or something like that. But it's nothing like what you see today, right? It doesn't have nowhere near the volume that we see now. You can go on the internet and you will see literally millions of articles, comments, YouTube videos where men are just hating women. You see that with the MGTOW movement. Now, why is this happening? It is a inevitable reaction to the domination of bitchistan, because you have nowadays women being conditioned so that they can act like bitches. I mean, bitch behavior is promoted explicitly. It's greatly promoted. And what you would have eventually, and this is inevitable, is a reaction. And we are seeing that reaction right now, where the marriage rate right now is at an all-time low. Men's enthusiasm for getting married is at the lowest it has ever been in American history, probably in world history. And what does this eventually lead to? Well, it eventually leads to men joining the military. Who are the best recruits? Again, we go back to the military, and we go back to recruitment, be it by the military or be it by gangs. Who make the best recruits? Single men. And I'm not even talking about just men who aren't married. I'm talking about men who ain't got no girlfriends. They are out of the sex market, okay? Those make the best recruits. And in fact, I have a friend who joined the Marine Corps, and he told me the first question, or one of the first questions that they ask you is, "Son, are you married?" "No." "Good. Keep it that way." Why? Because if you get married or if you get a girlfriend, then your attachment for her will begin to eclipse your attachment to the military. And if you are in the battlefield and you find out that your girlfriend or your wife is getting banged by Billy at the military base, then your attention is going to be on that as opposed to being on the mission, and that's when you get killed, or that's when the people next to you get killed. And that's why it's important to stay single. And they say stay single until you get out of the military. Stay unmarried until you get out of the military. So the best recruits are single men. And when you have this much sexual frustration being exhibited in the male population, when you see so much anti-female sentiment being expressed in the male population, you have your work cut out for you at this point if you're the military. And I suspect that this is all part of the conspiracy. Why are they promoting such polarization between the two genders? Why are they promoting such hatred between men and women? On both sides. You have the MGTOW group, and they say a lot of things that are true, But what started the MGTOW group, the MGTOW, and MGTOW, for those of you who don't know, it's an acronym that simply stands for Men Going Their Own Way, MGTOW. And the MGTOW and all the other groups like it, and all the men who are like, we're sick of women, screw these bitches, blah, blah, blah. This is all a reaction to bitch behavior that men are sick of. The games, the power hungriness that is seen in women, how women are only interested in men with status, or that appear to be men with status, how women are interested in criminals and drug dealers and all these things. So many men are sick of this that they're just staying away from women, and they're just content with playing video games. And I don't blame them, to be honest with you, because I'm 27 years old, still single, haven't dated anyone in a significant amount of time, and I can totally understand it. But at the same time, I'm red-pilled, so I understand the military complex and how it works. I am suspecting that the polarization between the sexes was an engineered, deliberate, devised plan so that the military can have men join the military. I mean, the draft is no more. How do you get men to join the military? Make them sexually frustrated. So you promote bitch behavior, you promote this terrible behavior amongst females, get men all pissy, they join the military. Look at China. You have this extremely low female population in China, extremely high male population in China. Well, you have the perfect conditions for the military in China, because now you have all these men who are sexually frustrated, who don't really have much going for them in their lives. They join the military. So I would not doubt that this is all part of an engineered enterprise. I remember reading an article a number of years ago by George Friedman, and he wrote an article on Spain. And what he said was true, because what he described is exactly what I saw when I was in Spain back in 2015. And he wrote that Spain right now is going through a horrible depression, and it is. And it is going through a depression just as bad as what the United States dealt with back in the 1920s. 25% unemployment. You have a lot of men living in the streets. And these aren't men who are, uneducated people. These are men who went through education. They did not get degrees in useless subjects like, some bullshit subject like, I don't know, art history or something like that. These are men who went through trade school, in welding, in metalwork, in electricity, and in plumbing. Types of trades that are always on demand, and they can't find a job, and it's very frustrating. And George Friedman said something that was very interesting. He said that this is the type of generation that goes to war. And he pretty much ended the article with that. This is the type of generation that goes to war because they don't have any jobs, they don't have a wife, they don't have a family, and family is what really keeps society orderly. I mean, we have belittled the family, but government begins with family. The most powerful government is the family, and we, disturbingly enough, have forsaken that government. And we have decided to enslave ourselves to banks and to pharmaceutical companies. The banks enslave us through our pocket because we get loans from them and then we're indebted to them. And the pharmaceuticals get us addicted to their drugs. That's why we are the most medicated society in the world. And that's why the most desired drug from the pharmaceutical companies is Prozac. And so we have decided to enslave ourselves to the government as opposed to actually creating or producing the most powerful of governments, and that is the family. Because with the family, you have a self-governing system from the father and the mother. You have morals that are instilled in the children. And you have an incentive to make money because you have a family to take care of. You have an incentive to be responsible because if you're a parent, you have to be responsible in order to maintain a good family. And that is how you maintain order in society. We have decided to throw that out. And that's why I have rarely ever seen a stable family in the United States. And I mean that seriously. Like, I have met a lot of Americans. I'm an American myself, born in the United States. Been living in America for most of my life, except for the fact that I lived in Mexico for a year. But other than that, I've been living in the United States. And I rarely ever met a stable family. The amount of stable families that I have met in all of my years living here, I can literally count on one hand. They're all dysfunctional, divorced. You meet a kid from school, and oh, this is my daddy, and he's my second daddy. Mama got a divorce, and now she's married to Billy over here. My other dad, I see him, once a week, and I saw so much of that shit growing up, and it was very strange to me because I grew up in a very stable family home. And you meet these families, and guess what happens? Fathers will say, well, son, you're going to get out of the house by the age of 18 or 19. They get out of the house. They have no idea what to do. Then they enslave themselves to the banks because they get a house loan, they get a school loan, they get a car loan, and they're literally in debt for the rest of their lives. And we sit here talking about masculinity, and the very people who are talking about, oh, how there's such little masculinity in society are the very people who threw their kids out and allowed them to become slaves to the banks. So don't give me this bullshit about masculinity. If we actually all follow the ancient way, the way that my father raised me, the way that his father raised him, the way that his father's father raised him, we wouldn't have so many of these problems. What I mean by that is, if parents did not allow their kids to be enslaved to the banks and said, son, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to, with all the money that I've saved up, I'm going to get you that house. I'm going to help start your life, as opposed to you being in debt. So it's, instead of the son being indebted to the father, or sorry, I should say, instead of the son being indebted to the bank, the son would be indebted to the father and grateful, and it would be maintained in the family. But we don't want to do that. And yet we keep talking about, oh, how we need masculinity and all this nonsense and all this bullshit. And we give power to the pharmaceutical companies and to the banks. And then we get angry at the banks. And then some politician comes along and says, I will fight the banks and I will fight the pharmaceutical companies. No, they're not. Because the pharmaceutical companies and the banks have pretty much all the money. Big corporations have all the money. They own the world. And so some politician scams you for a vote and says, I'm going to fight the pharmaceutical companies, I'm going to fight the banks. And the idiot who's voting for this politician for that reason wants his cake. They want their cake and they want to eat it too. Because they think, oh, this politician is going to fight the banks and fight the pharmaceuticals. What they think in their own minds is this politician is going to get us free drugs and free money. And then it doesn't happen, and then they're like, oh, why is this happening? Oh, government is the problem. No, you're the problem, because you have enslaved yourself and your children to these big corporations and to these banks. And I will close with this. When you have such hatred between the genders, and this hatred is promoted, and it is being encouraged and motivated, and in conjunction with that, you have a high rate of unemployment, a high rate of singleness, men being single specifically, then what you have is the type of generation that goes to war. And that's that. This is Theodore Shoebat. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You just heard some theology. God bless and God be with us.